revolt of 1857 in the Indian subcontinent is taken to be a watershed in history of British Indian rule. Now, the point here is that we have discussed the causes behind the revolt, the uprising of 1857, as well as the course of the revolt and the nature of the revolt. So, it is important to see how exactly the revolt of 1857 took place as an outburst of a rebellion. How did it impact the Indian subcontinent, the Indian masses, as well as the British government here? So after, the British government had led for a point of time in the Indian subcontinent where the power was rested in the East India Company's hands, an event like that of the revolt of 1857 took place. So automatically it was for sure that the power was not to be given into the estate's hand anymore, to the company's hands anymore. The power was then taken from the East India Company's hands and given directly to the hands of Queen Victoria of England. So we see that Queen Victoria is called as the Empress of India, and the Government of India Act of 1858 established this very idea. So it conferred the right to govern India to the British Crown. So Queen Victoria was proclaimed as the Empress of India. As you can see here, this is a cartoon sketch that depicts the British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, presenting Queen Victoria with a crown that makes her the Empress of India. So this is Queen Victoria and Prime Minister Disraeli here. Now, there were of course certain other clauses that came with the power now residing at the hands of the British Crown. The first thing that happened was that the company directors and board of control were dissolved. So as we discussed the fact that the power was no more in the hands of the East India Company, it was entirely under the British Crown, under Queen. So we see that the company directors and boards who were actually governing India, that power was taken away. Now, the responsibility of governing India was given to the Secretary of State for India. So, a position was established which was called the Secretary of State for India that would directly report, the happenings to the Queen and would have a direct contact with Britain as well. So ideally the Secretary of State was the direct representative of the British Crown. Now, the Secretary of State of India was to be assisted by the Indian Council. So, the Indian Council was given a lot of powers, and the India Council was to be of 15 members in total. Now, 15 members of whom the 7 members would be of British origin. So they would have to be Britishers, and they would have to be the Britishers who had been serving under the Crown for more than 10 years. So ideally, if you try and look at the development of these factors that are being brought in as the changes after the Crown is given power, you will be able to see that there is an amount of increased control, per se political control, that the British Crown is exercising on India. We see that for proper governance, because if you remember under the East India Company, there was a revolt that happened. So for better governance than that, half of the members of the Council of India Council would be British officers who served in India for at least 10 years. So the Crown could not rely on anyone else other than, in fact, the Britishers who had been attached to the idea of this colony, to the idea of imperialism in India. Now, we can clearly see that the Secretary of State then would be creating rules guiding the open competitive examination for appointment to the Indian civil services. So the Secretary of State then would be the highest personnel in India who would have direct contact with the Queen and would also take crucial decisions like that of the Indian civil services examinations that was to be held to appoint people for working for the government, that is to work for the Queen here. Now, we also realize that the Secretary of the State was to derive all funds from India, as to say that the Secretary of State was to be paid from the revenue that was generated out of India. So, all these factors, all these changes that were brought in by, the British Crown, after the British Crown gained power, we can clearly state the fact that these political changes are not only to clamp down on India more, but also to make the political power more pronounced over Indian colony. So the next change, political change that happened, was that Lord Canning, who was the then Governor General, he remained the Governor General but was conferred with the title of a Viceroy. So from now on, after the Secretary of State would come the Viceroy. So Lord Canning became the first Viceroy of India. So can you tell me who was the first Viceroy of India? Was it Warren Hastings, Lord Canning, Lord Mountbatten, or William Jones? The correct answer will be Lord Canning. So all these clauses and all these changes were announced in India by the Queen's Proclamation. So the Queen's Proclamation was read out in 1st November 1858 in India, that discussed these political changes that was brought by the British Crown. The first would be non-intervention in Indian religious practices. As seen as a cause of the revolt of 1857, intervention in religious ideologies was something that had triggered the Indian masses to move towards the revolt of 1857. Now, the Queen clearly stated that no intervention was to be done from the Britishers' side into the religious matters of the Indians. But here is a loophole which we do have to take notice, is that they did not state that they would, by no means intervene. So, to leave matters of Indian origin to India itself was not something that the Crown was to do. So the Crown did decide to not intervene per se, but it was not like Indians could now govern themselves, in fact in the religious stances as well. So we see the next point is equality in treatment of British and Indian subjects of British Empire. So here the Queen noted that there was an amount of discrimination that was built between the British subjects and the Indian subjects on the basis of caste and various other things. So that would not be done, though this was an eyewash per se, because if we come to discuss the most important aspect of service, which was the civil services examination that was held, the number of Indians that were taken in was abysmal. So it was very minimal. So the openings, the opportunities for Indians were very limited. But the Queen did state that the treatment would have been equal. So the Queen also pardoned the people who took part in the revolt, except those who were involved in killing of the British. So a lot of English men were killed at that point of time, massacred at that point of time, but the Queen still pardoned them. Pardoned the people who were a part of the revolt, but did not pardon the people who had killed Englishmen per se. So we can understand that it is almost like giving a little power in the hands of the Indians, almost like giving no punishment to the Indians, but in reality changing the face of political character that would involve the governance of the Crown in India. encouragement of industries and public work in India. So Queen clearly stated that the focus would now be shifted to the growth of India as a nation, India as a colony. So welfare of India was in focus, which wasn't rendered even after the proclamation was given. So here we see that the British government would not annex Indian states. If you remember, the doctrine of lapse as well as the subsidiary alliance had been issued on the Indian princely states and on the Indian kingdoms that existed. So both these were, banned. Doctrine of lapse as well as subsidiary alliance was banned, and the Queen stated that those princely states who had princesses who still held the princely states, they could remain the heads of the state, but of course, as we can understand by now, that most of the administrative powers would lie in the British Crown's hands, and these rulers would just be puppet kings who would be seated in the apex of these princely states. So if we try and quickly recapitulate the political consequences that occurred after the revolt of 1857, first was the end of company rule. So now the power of the Indian colony moved from British East India Company to the hands of the British Crown. So we see that India enters into the age of British Raj. Essentially, the Government of India Act of 1858 gave all governance powers, as we saw, of India from the Board of Directors to the Secretary of State of India, who was directly under the Queen, the British Crown, and the Secretary of State for India was to be assisted by the India Council, whose more than half of the members of the council would have to be officers who have served for more than 10 years in experience in India, and of course who would be Britishers. So Lord Canning, who was the then Governor General of India, was made the first Viceroy of India. Queen Victoria was proclaimed as the Empress of India, and all powers now lay in the hands of the British Crown. So finally, the relevance of Mughals and Peshwas ended, and the remaining Indian royals, like that of Nizam of Hyderabad, accepted the prince status, so a nominal status without real powers, to acknowledge the British Queen. So they were in fact seated in the apex position of the princely states, but the real power lay in the hands of the Queen herself. So it is not unknown to us by now that the British colonizers who were ruling over the Indians, they were led by the idea of discrimination, the idea that Indians were in fact inferior in race than the British colonizers, than the British natives. So these indigenous people of India were constantly discriminated against, and the every policy by the British colonizers were in fact driven to hold the Indian natives lower and to place them in a position where they can never prosper ahead of the British colonizers. So there were several changes that after the British Crown in fact came to power, these changes became more pronounced, but these changes also had the factors of discrimination, divide, and the entire idea of how to govern these people who were just a colony. So we see that Indians were constantly subjected to racial discrimination by Britishers. Now entry to various public places were restricted for the Indians. So we see that various socio-economic changes are being made in the part of the British Crown, and it is banning Indian indigenous native people to move freely in the public places like that of parks and schools. And basically what happened was the places got divided. So whenever or wherever a British would go or visit there, and Indians should not be visiting. So the places were also divided and they were discriminated upon. For example, if you look at the label right here, which is a board, this discriminatory sign was put up in colonial times by the British against the Indians, where it is written, Royal Shimla Club, no dogs or Indians allowed. So imagine, Indians were not only treated as uncivilized people, but also who were equal to animals. So the treatment that could be meted out to the animals apparently was something that the colonizers could mete out to the colonized. So till this point of time, we have seen that the Britishers did want to bring certain, changes in the way the Indians perceived religion as well, because the Britishers, the colonizers, till this point of time did not allow any markers to be worn by the, by the sepoys, by the armies of Indian origin. So no markers, religious markers were to be worn. But that was changed after, British Crown took power. So here in this picture, we can see that Punjab regiment soldiers allowed to wear community markers. So the Punjab regiment soldiers could wear turbans and, whatever marked their religion. Till one point of time, that wasn't allowed. Now, what caused this change? If you go back to the time when we were discussing that who were the people who supported the British in repressing the revolt, if you remember, we had discussed that the Sikh regiment, the Gurkha regiment, there were certain other people from the Maratha clan who supported the British in repressing the revolt. So ideally we can understand that the British now wanted to separate who was from where, so that none of the army regiments would be heavy with a common sort of fraternity or brotherhood. So they could not unite amongst themselves and cause another uprising. So it was now allowed, and every religious marker, every religious aspect that the army wanted to sort of take on was allowed by the Queen. So we saw that the rebellion happened because the Hindus and the Muslims had been united to fight against the British. Now the British, of course, thought, they were trying to find avenues as to how to stop it. So we see that the Britishers come up with this entire concept and policy of divide and rule, where they could divide between Hindus and Muslims, sometimes supporting, one group or the other, so that there can be a division and there could not be a unity among themselves, so that common brotherhood, that common unified feeling is not felt, and they cannot anymore rebel against the British colonizers. So we can understand by this very animation that now that the British Crown had power, it was trying to place ways where Indians were no more in a position to gather a harmonious feeling where they can come out in an uprising. The idea of these thoughts were sown by James Mill. James Mill was the mind that devised this idea of communal division of Indian history. Now you might think that, how did writing of Indian history, in fact, have any effect on the political changes? But we have to understand that when James Mill wrote History of India, he wrote it in a way that he divided three ages. One was the Hindu age that had ancient India. Second was the Muslim age that had the time when the Mughals came in, Muslim rulers were ruling. And third was that of the British rule. So the Hindu age was seen as the golden age, whereas the Muslim age was seen as the age filled with tyranny, with a lot of pain, destruction, and the British age was filled with the concepts of how the British were saving the civilization, were making the Indians civilized in true sense. So you can understand how in establishing the history itself, he divided Hindus and Muslims in the idea that one category brought wrath to India and the other was the ideal time when India had flourished. So this entire idea of communal divide, to divide and rule on the people of India, was in fact devised by James Mill when he first took to writing of Indian history. Who was the mind behind the communal division of Indian history into Hindu, Muslim and British periods? Was it William Bentinck, James Mill, Warren Hastings or William Jones? The correct answer will be James Mill. So, now till this point of time, we have seen that certain social changes then were being made by the British Crown. But we have till now in fact seen and discussed the factor that when East India Company was also governing over India, the entire motive of East India Company was to derive maximum revenue. That idea did not change when British Crown took to power. So India was in fact reduced to a colonial economy from which most amount of taxation was derived, the most amount of revenue was to be generated and sucked out. So we see that India was reduced to a colonial economy. It was wrenched out for its raw materials and was being flooded with British products manufactured out of those raw materials. Now, the British East India Company was also taking away raw materials, and so was the British Crown. Now, the raw materials were again being taken without paying a price for it, and the Indian markets were being flooded with the machine finished British goods that was being imported from Britain without any any taxes or any leverages when it was imported. So we can see that the British products that are being created in Britain and England, that is being supplied to these vast markets of the colonies, which is not only becoming a producer of raw materials but also a market for the goods. Now, in order to establish a market for British goods, the Indian handicrafts had to suffer, as we have seen before as well. These economic, policies or ideas did not in fact change when the British Crown gained power. In fact, it became more pronounced. So we see that Indian handicrafts could not compete with these cheap British products, machine-made products, and thereby leading to the decline of indigenous handicraft industries. So there became, a time when the Indian industries, Indian indigenous native handicrafts, textile industries are going through a phase of deindustrialization. So for Britain to prosper when industrial revolution was happening in England, colonies like India had to go through a man-made phase of deindustrialization, destruction of their homemade, homegrown industries that would generate an economy for India that was entirely destroyed by the British. So we see that unjust land use and revenue system impoverished the peasants. Now, not only were the economic systems, made in the way where it would grapple the people of India, it was also the laws of land use, various permanent settlements, royalty settlements, and the policies of the land that impoverished the peasants to a level where they could not provide such heavy taxes, and automatically their land was taken away from them. So Indians had to pay high dividends on British capital investments, even though the capital was mostly derived from Indian revenues itself. So we see that the economic policies were so overbearing on the Indians that not only were they paying their share of taxes, not only were they generating revenues for the British Crown, but also they were paying salaries to all these British personnel who are placed in India. The Secretary of State was being paid by Indian revenues. So India as a colony was bearing salaries to revenues to profits for the British Crown.
तुमको उधार का पैसा चुकाना ही पड़ेगा, लेकिन नील की बोनी से, चाहे इसमें तुम्हारी पूरी जिंदगी ही कट जाए, समझे?
बस 1 साल की मोहलत दे दीजिए हुजूर। उधार की चुकती पैसे में ले लीजिए। अगर मैं नील बोऊंगा तो मैं मर जाऊंगा मालिक।
चुप रहो बदमाश, तुम अपने आप को बहुत ज्यादा अक्लमंद समझने लग गए हो। जिस भी गवार से पूछो वो बोलता हम नील की पेशगी नहीं लेंगे। मैं अगर नाराज हुआ तो तुम में से अब ध्यान से सुन लो बदमाशों, मैं तुमको जिंदा छोड़ दूंगा 2 शर्तों पे। 1, तुम सब इस कागज पर अंगूठा लगाओगे और नील की पेशगी की रकम कबूल करोगे, और 2, जब पुलिस यहां आएगी तफ्तीश करने को तो तुम लोग इस बात के बारे में सांस तक नहीं लोगे, समझे? और अगर तुमने इनकार किया तो मैं तुम सबको
As you saw in the video, the amount of exploitation that was being done by the British colonizers were so excessive on the peasants that this continuous amount of exploitation ultimately led to smaller rebellions like that of the Indigo Rebellion. Now, the British colonizers made it a staple for peasants to grow indigos on their land, and the peasants who did not agree to grow indigo on their land, they were killed and they were tortured. This Indigo Rebellion happened from 1866 and went on till 1868 in Bihar. Now, we can of course then go back and recapitulate the socio-economic consequences that took place after the revolt of 1857. So the first one was of course that the Britishers were involved in a systematic discrimination against Indians. So we saw that Indians were not allowed to move higher than the Britishers. They were not allowed higher posts. They were not allowed posts of officers. In fact, they were not allowed more salaries than an Englishman who was appointed maybe in the same designation as well. So Indians were ideally kept lower and were constantly discriminated on the basis of their race. We see that a revolt like 1857, so that it does not occur again, the British applied the divide and rule policy intended to create a rift between Hindus and Muslims. So ideally, so that the Hindus and Muslims do not form that fraternal bond anymore, cannot unite against the British Crown and rebel like the 1857's event, they were divided in a way where starting from the way history was written was taken into account. So the drain of wealth from India was intensified through unjust trade practices, excessive taxation, high salaries for officials, and similar processes. These often led to smaller rebellions like that of Indigo Rebellion, which happened in 1866 and went on till 1868 in Bihar. So we see that these unjust practices on land, heavy taxation, and various economic policies ultimately did not die down, in fact, when the crown took to power. So after the British Crown took power, it not only generated socio-economic and political consequences in the colony, but we see that there are certain rearrangements that are being done in the militaristic sense as well. So the military consequences firstly included that the number of British soldiers were increased in the British Indian Army regiments. So we see that now the Indian sepoys were no more given, no more given an amount of advantage even. So the British recruits were increased in the army. And we also see that the main ammunition, arms and ammunitions were all located in the hands of the British soldiers and not Indian soldiers. So the second point is that no Indian soldier was admitted to a military officer's class and was prevented from possessing any sophisticated weaponry, lest they rise in a rebellion, lest they form a rebellion and rise against the British. So you can clearly see how the Indian soldier is only limited to an officer's class. There is no chance of moving ahead per se than an English recruit or an English soldier. So the policy of balance and counter check was used. Balance and counter check was a policy where a lot of Indian recruits were not kept in one regiment, so that there is no harmonious and fraternal unity being built in them, that they can go ahead and rebel. So we can understand that the ratio of the army personnel, if it is Indians, that were kept together was very mixed. So it was also the case that the original place of a person was not the same place that they were recruited in. So a person from Awadh would not be recruited in the regiment of Awadh. They would be recruited in some other regiment. So that feeling of unity, that feeling of brotherhood, or in fact the feeling of a sense towards the region should not be the case anymore. That develops into a rebellion against the British. So we see that discord was sown by giving preference to certain caste and community while recruiting the soldiers. If you remember, we have discussed the fact that there were certain regiments like the Sikhs and the Gurkhas and the other people who had supported the British colonizers in repressing the revolt of 1857. So that was taken into regard, and army was recruited more in these regiments, and they were moved and they were given higher preference than the places which rose in revolt. Army was taken lesser from there. The most important factor is that no newspapers, journals, publications was provided to the soldiers, thereby subduing nationalism within the army. So that the army is never informed about what is happening somewhere else and what is happening in pockets of the subcontinent. If somebody is rising in rebellion, if somebody has voiced their opinion against the British, these things were something that the British wanted the army to be kept away from, so that the army does not support the ideas of nationalism. Because we have to understand, and we have seen the fact that the army in fact had the stance where they could pull a rebellion like that of 1857 if they wanted to. Thus we see that the way British Crown took to power when Queen Victoria was declared as the Empress of India, the exploitation, torture and various policies that were ideally to extract out of the Indians was not given up. We see that the British rule in India starts to take more ground when the Crown comes to power. Now, the hands that had the power was the British Parliament, which was to decide the fate of the Indian colony. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at deltastep.com or download the DeltaStep app to get access to all our 5000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly, learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads.